Okay, hi everybody. I'm Dr. Dom Davies. I'm a senior lecturer in English in the Department of English at City University of London, and I hope you're in the right place. This is uh, a kind of introductory talk or a kind of sample lecture, I suppose, sample session that I've put together to give you a taste of the sort of things that we do on the BA English and also the MA English program here at City. So today I'm going to talk to you about time and space in comics and graphic novels. So we're going to focus on comics and graphic novels, but some of the kind of basic concepts I want to try and communicate to you are applicable to other forms of literary work like poetry or prose even. I teach quite a few comics and graphic novels on the course, more so as one of my research specialties. So City has a particularly healthy dose of comics and graphic novels on the BA program. No specific module or kind of set series of reading comics as such, but rather they're kind of interspersed throughout your degree. So yeah, today I want to give you a taste of the sorts of things that comics and graphic novels allow us to get at and to grasp. So when I talk about comics, I imagine this is probably what you think of. You probably think of the kind of the Marvel superhero, the Incredible Hulk, Spider-Man, Captain America. Recently made famous, of course, or even more famous. They were already very famous, but made even more famous by the Avengers and the relentless film franchises of the Marvel universe. Comics tend to be quite reductively, I think, sort of reduced to perhaps something a little bit childish, maybe, or certainly some form of popular culture, right? You wouldn't think that if you did a BA in English undergraduate, you were going to study comics because they seem kind of slightly not trashy, but certainly kind of not the kind of highbrow culture that we associate with English literature degrees, perhaps. So I want to challenge this in this session, and I want to show how comics are actually extremely clever and innovative with form. And one way to think about this, and one way to get at the way that they're really clever, is by looking at the way they deal with time and space. And also, I'll conclude this lecture once we've gone into a kind of sort of close analysis of some of the ways in which time and space works. Then I'll also show how comics have been used to document more serious stories, right? So not necessarily a sort of superhero fantasy universe, although that is, potentially very serious. The destruction of Manhattan seems quite serious to me. But also to document things like people who don't have a voice, or to document big historical events like the Holocaust or the experience of refugees. But before we start, so in order to get really into this idea of time and space, I need to just talk you through the shape of the comics page, what we call the architecture of the comics page. And I'm going to begin with this example from Black Panther. So you can see, another very famous film, which I hope you've all seen and strongly recommend if you haven't. So this is what we call the architecture of the comics page. We have here, if you can see my mouse here on the screen, my pointer, we have here a panel. So so this page is composed of 5 panels. And then in this intervening area, this is what we call the gutter. This is, for some critics and commentators, this is the most important thing on the comics page. Very counterintuitively, you'd have thought. You'd think it would be these images, right? But actually, a lot of work happens in this non-place called the gutter. And that's because unlike kind of narrative prose, where we're reading and moving through time continuously, if you think about reading a sentence across a page, with comics, instead we have frozen scenes, right? So we don't have anything continuous. Another way to think of it is to think of it like film, but film we have 24 frames a second, and we have a stream of images coming, and we don't see, basically, in film, we don't see the joins between the different panels, if that makes sense, because there is 24 of them a second, and we don't notice the gaps between the 24 different frames. But comics, however, has, you know, clearly in this scene, more than a few seconds have passed, probably several minutes, and we've only got 5 frames. So time is operating kind of strangely on this page, and a lot of time is passing in what we call here in the gutters, right? So we only get snapshots of the action. We don't get a continuous flow of the action like we do in film. So comics are kind of, it's almost like a kind of, if you think of it like a script board, if you've ever seen one of those that people use to lay out their plans for a film, except that even a script board will have many, many more panels than a comic would. A comic is much more importantly hides time, if you like, or it mobilizes time inside these gutter spaces. And that's because, where does that time go? It goes to the reader to fill in. Okay, this is why comics are such an interesting, deal with time in such an interesting way. And if you can see what I mean, they're dealing with time spatially on the page. So time takes up space rather than being something that says, you know, 1,000 years passed in a sentence and we just jump. Comics have to demonstrate that visually on the page. When we as readers read, for example, if we take these 2 bottom panels, we see that T'Challa, who's the sort of the king of the Black Panther, the king, is running across through this forest here, and we see that between this panel and this panel, he's made some progress, and in this gap, we as the reader fill in that the progress that he's made in running through the forest, right? So we imagine him running through the forest. So as we read those 2 panels, we fill in the time that is represented spatially on the page. Okay, so this makes comics a really kind of interactive reading experience because we have to actively participate, much more so than with either literature or film. We have to fill in the gaps, if you like, quite actively as readers with our imaginations. So comics, we associate comics perhaps with, you know, these kind of superheroes, and here's another very famous one of those, Batman, who I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. But something very important happens in around the 1980s. So just before I was born, long before most of you were born, I'm sure. Around that time, comics start to become what we call today graphic novels. We get the earliest examples of graphic novels, and the difference, I think, is that, you know, even though some of them are still superhero narratives, superhero stories, they become much more serious. They start to deal with ethical issues and moral issues that are much more adult, if you like. And of course, they still have an attraction they still have a readership among children too. But adults start to take them seriously. And one of the key comics to come out in the 1980s that does this is Frank Miller's Batman, which takes Batman away from the kind of slightly camp, silly superhero, right, dressed up in a Batman costume. It is a little bit silly if we think about it too much. And he takes him away from that and turns him into this very brooding, very serious figure who really starts to say, you know, what does it mean to be a superhero? Is it okay to be a superhero, actually? Don't we have a police force and laws who deal with justice? And isn't Batman just a kind of glorified vigilante? And aren't vigilantes sort of criminals? And he starts to ask these kind of quite probing questions about the dominant comics form, and starts to raise these kind of stickier things. So no longer, this isn't just Captain America now saving the world yet again from a bunch of Nazis. suddenly the kind of poles of good and evil start to become a little bit muddied and a little bit complicated. And if any of you've seen Christopher Nolan's film, most recent film franchise, which is the Dark Knight Rises and the Dark Knight Returns, then, you know, with Heath Ledger's very famous depiction of the Joker, you'll know that Batman is actually very serious in this franchise. And Christopher Nolan's franchise is very much informed by Frank Miller's franchise, which treats the superhero not as a clear-cut good guy, but as something a little bit more morally ambiguous. And what's important to note, as I want to show you on this page, is that by through these, as you can sort, if we think back to these kind of basic frames of Black Panther, instead we have a more innovative use of what we call the form or the architecture of the comics page. So now we have, yes, we have frames and we have panels and we have borders and we have these gutters here. So we know that action is taking place between these different panels, but you can see Frank Miller's incredibly innovative use of space, and that he's making the form actually enhance the content of the themes of the comic, if you like. So here, you know, we're overhearing a kind of public broadcast in this page, and so he uses this kind of TV-shaped panel to communicate this is taking place somewhere else. And you can see that there are also things like bleeds here. So Batman is kind of bleeding out into the page, and there isn't any strictly kind of sort of formal or, you know, rigid kind of way of reading this page. That actually you need a slightly more intelligent, I suppose, or at least a more complex way of navigating the comics page. It's less intuitive. And so just as we have to engage with a slightly more complex idea of the superhero, we have to also engage with a slightly more complex layout of the comics page. And so this, I think this is one of the key ideas I want to communicate to you today, is that the relationship between content, so the stuff of the narrative, the thing that's the moral and ethical ideas that are being communicated, the themes, the symbols, you know, you'll have done this in your in A-level English classes, that kind of stuff is fundamentally related to and communicated through the form of the comic as well. And this is something that if you're doing a kind of close reading of a poem, you know, you'll be expected to be able to do, is to show how the content is communicated through the form of the poem. And what we're seeing here is comics already doing this almost intuitively on the page, and teaching us how to read critically and creatively in that way. So I want now to turn to an extremely important example, a kind of pioneering comics text or graphic novel written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Dave Gibbons, that comes out kind of at the end of the 1980s and is really hailed by several, really, you know, or recognised today by literary critics as one of the sort of most powerful graphic novels in the world. And it's called The Watchmen. And I would normally, if I could communicate with you directly, I would ask you, I'd be interested to know how many of you have heard of this comic, and how many of you or how many of you seen the film. And I'll show you a trailer from the film in a second to give you a sense of the structure. But just to talk about the title, The Watchmen describes, or the basic plot of Alan Moore's comic, as the Watchmen are a group of superheroes who were really big in the kind of 50s, a bit like the superhero comics were, and they were very famous and celebrated by the public. And then basically people get fed up with superheroes in this universe. And so the Watchmen, who used to be a group of kind of superheroes watching over people, retire. They go into retirement. So time passes and they go into retirement. And they come, The Watchmen is really about them deciding to re-enter the world, to come back and to try and save the world from nuclear annihilation. And if you think about the fact that this is written in the 1980s, then, you know, that makes sense, because at the time, you know, that was at the height of the Cold War, when nuclear apocalypse was very much a certainty. And the main character, or the kind of main superhero at the center of the Watchmen, is this blue figure here, Dr. Manhattan. And Dr. Manhattan has a very interesting relationship with time. So he doesn't see time in the way that we see time. We experience time as something linear, in the way that this lecturer is linear. It has a beginning, middle, and end. I can see the time clicking away on the clock. Time only moves forwards, and it moves forwards constantly. It doesn't go back or anything like that. So that's the way we usually experience time. And if you think about reading a novel, for example, we follow the sentence forward in time. We aren't asked to. We might choose to turn back a page to remind ourselves of something that happened, but we don't. And the novel itself might go back in time. It might, you know, tell us a scene that we hadn't seen before. But our process of reading is essentially linear. Whereas this is very different, of course, to the way in which we read comics, when we can see, when we can look at a page and we can see this event happening at exactly the same time as this event. Of course, we'll put a narrative on it as we read through those panels moving in that way forward. But at any one time, we can't just see a single panel. We can see multiple panels, and we connect them up in that way. And as though to kind of allegorize, or as a metaphor for our own reading process of the comic, Dr. Manhattan himself has the power to see time simultaneously. Okay? So in this scene, he's looking at a photograph of himself as a young man. And then he's saying, you know, as a child, he remembers being fascinated by a watchmaker. And then now here he is stood on Mars, and he's 56 years old in 1985. And he's looking at the photograph, and the photograph, if you think about it, is almost like a kind of a comics panel. So he's seeing through time. And so in a way, the comic allows us to see, a bit like Dr. Manhattan, the way in which we construct time and how we piece it together. It allows us to see through time as actually something that is constantly in relationship with itself. As a narrative is something that we build as readers. You know, we make the connections between these panels by reading in the gutters, as we saw in the previous slide. But time is something we construct, and time is something we construct spatially. Okay, so time is space in comics and graphic novels. That's a key idea. Time is space. So that's quite a complicated idea. I'll come back to it in a second. I'm just going to show you a trailer for Watchmen because it's kind of fun. And it's a film I would definitely worth watching. Definitely recommend watching, even if you don't have time to read the graphic novel.
It's a matter of time, I suppose.
Watchmen, one of us died tonight. Somebody knows why. Somebody knows.
I heard he'd been working for the government. Maybe it was a political killing.
Maybe someone's picking off costumed heroes.
John thinks that there's going to be a nuclear war.
What if that's why someone wants us out of the way? So we can't do anything to stop it. An attack on one is an attack on all of us.
Watchmen are over. What do you suggest we do about it?
Retribution.
We can save this world.
Why would I save the world? I no longer have any stake in.
Do it for me.
The world will look up and shout, "Save us." And I'll whisper, "No."
So I think, as you can see from that trailer, that Alan Moore's Watchmen is really probing that idea of superheroes being somehow simple or good, or you know, a benevolent force that we should all celebrate. That actually, you know, this is something super problematic. But I also think, again, thinking about that relationship between content and form, right? That this troubling of a kind of quite simple narrative about superheroes comes hand in hand with this really innovative way of representing time spatially. Even though Moore and Dave Gibbons actually don't, you know, they're not like Frank Miller. They don't use interesting shapes. They follow this very regular 9-panel grid. But they use that in a really creative way, as you can see here in this slightly more extended version of the page I showed you a moment ago. You can see how you know, these different moments from Manhattan's life, because he has these kind of superpowers to see through time, that the comic allows us to almost have the same superpowers, right? And that's one of the kind of key messages of The Watchmen, is that, like, are superheroes that special, actually, you know, or are they just the comics readers themselves? Here's another quick, one of his more famous sayings when he says, "There is no future, there is no past. Do you see?" He's obviously speaking to his, to the other character here, but you know, he could just as well be speaking to us, the reader, because, you know, we can see both past and present all at the same time. And this leads to some really interesting techniques about, or some questions about the form of comics, that even if we have a single image that's a single moment, what happens if we start building the form of comics, what we call the comics grid, over the top of images? So this is technically a single image, and yet even these thin gutters, they almost like, not like magic, but, you know, they kind of create for us a sense that this is happening, and then this is happening, and then this is happening. As you can see that, you know, she's smoking a cigarette in this scene, and that she's almost finished the cigarette in this scene, that time has passed and yet space has kind of stayed the same. So there are loads of really interesting formal techniques that allow us to explore these, the way in which time works in comics. And I'm going to, in order to really get to grips with those, we need to turn to one of the most important theorists of comics, Scott McCloud, who wrote in 1993, so not long after The Watchmen was published, a book about how to understand comics. And yes, he wrote it in comics form. So it's a comic about understanding comics. And this kind of self-reflexivity of a kind of almost like a meta-narrative, right, is typical of comics. Comics are very, very good at that, because in a way, comics are always meta-narratives, because they always need you and me, the reader, to build the pieces together. So I'm going to just show you a little bit of a TED Talk that Scott McCloud did, that introduced you to some of the basic concepts of his thinking.
I started making comics, but I also started trying to understand them almost immediately. One of the most important things about comics I discovered was that comics are a visual medium, but they try to embrace all the senses within it. So the different elements of comics, like pictures and words, and the different symbols and everything in between that comics presents, are all funneled through the single conduit of vision. So we have things like resemblance, where something which resembles the physical world can be abstracted in a couple of different directions. Abstracted from resemblance, but still retaining the complete meaning, or abstracted away from both resemblance and meaning towards the picture plane. Put all these three together and you have a nice little map of the entire boundary of visual iconography, which comics can embrace. And if you move to the right, you also get language, because that's abstracting even further from resemblance, but still maintaining meaning. Vision is called upon to represent sound and to understand the common properties of those two and their common heritage as well. Also to try to represent the texture of sound, to capture its essential character through visuals. And there's also a balance between the visible and the invisible in comics. Comics is a kind of call and response in which the artist gives you something to see within the panels and then gives you something to imagine between the panels. Also, another sense which comics vision represents, and that's time. Sequence is a very important aspect of comics. Comics presents a kind of temporal map. And this temporal map was something that energizes modern comics, but I was wondering if perhaps it also energizes other sorts of forms, and I found some in history. And you can see this same principle operating in these ancient versions of the same idea. What's happening is art form is colliding with a given technology, whether it's paint on stone like the Tomb of Menna the Scribe in ancient Egypt, or bas-relief sculpture rising up a stone column, or a 200-foot long embroidery, or painted deerskin and tree bark running across 88 accordion folded pages. What's interesting is once you hit print, and this is from 1450, by the way, all of the artifacts of modern comics start to present themselves. Rectilinear panel arrangements, simple line drawings without tone, and a left-to-right reading sequence. And with 100 years, you already start to see word balloons and captions, and it's really just a hop, skip, and a jump from here to here.
So there's Scott McCloud speaking of his, speaking in quite technical comics language, but actually I'm just going to dig down into some of that now because it really helps us to understand how the comics page works and what the significance of that might be. So he begins that talk by talking about this idea of iconography and the idea that, yes, you might have, this is like what we would call a hyper-realist work, right? So this could only be that one man, but in comics we tend to use more abstract, and this is a way of kind of the more, as he says here, the more cartoony your face, the more people it could be said to describe. That actually a kind of identification with the comics page and with comics characters is something, that you could be anyone. This kind of face could represent any sort of middle-aged man, right, or even young man, because it's quite generic. This is a little less generic. And this is, as we get here, we get more and more realist. And this can represent, almost anyone at all. Now, for those of you who are fans of superhero narratives, you'll remember that one of the kind of most important things about a superhero is their mask, right? And one of the key plot lines of, certainly of things like Batman, even Superman, even though he doesn't wear a mask, he has a sort of super generic face, right? Is that they could be anyone. And this is another key idea that almost just in the way that readers have to imagine the things that don't happen, we have to, as Scott McCloud said in that sequence, we have things that we see, but also things that we have to imagine in between, in the gutter space. There's almost a similar process going on here with the superhero themselves, that we almost imagine ourselves into the page. And again, this is all part of the interactive reading of comics and graphic novels. But I just want to come back to that idea of time in comics because that's really important. So, as McCloud says here, each panel shows a single moment in time. Okay, we've kind of been talking about this in relationship to Watchmen. So we go boom, 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 like a line drawn between 2 points. However, things get a little bit interesting and complicated in comics when you can have, as we saw with the Watchmen, what he calls here a polyptych, where a moving figure or figures is imposed over a continuous background. So the background, the space, if you like, stays the same, but time is moving through that singular space. And the gutters here do incredibly important work, because we know if we saw this image without the gutters, might we assume that there were actually 4 people who looked a bit like Scott McCloud's comics Avatar? Obviously, that's not the case, and the gutters do important narrative work in breaking this down into a sequence for us. So McCloud plays a game. He says, what if you just drew a single panel, okay, such as this scene? And we can see here, you know, if we read this panel, because of the text is still fundamentally linear. Images are not. Images are spatial. We read the, we see that in a glance. We see that this is a single living room with people in it saying different things. When we read the text, because we're, you know, our sort of prime language is probably English, we start up here with the smile, and then we see the response. Ah, that flash is blinding. And then someone tells them to put the camera away. And then someone tells mum not to tell them to put the camera away. So this is a sequence running across the page here, right? But technically, because this is a single image, with people could all be speaking at once, and there, you know, the balloons suggest here that there's some overlap. Now, what happens if we put a series of grids over that? Suddenly, the narrative sequence becomes much more delineated. And actually, you know, by the time we get to here, we start kind of almost having a separate narrative. So this is one panel operating as several panels. And as McCloud says here, you know, well, that sequence is perhaps a little, not ambiguous, but a little unclear. Here we have a really carefully and well segmented narrative trajectory that's organized spatially on the page. Now, I just want to come back to that point earlier I was describing about, I suppose, the comics narrative as a bit like watching the frames of a film. And this is a comparison that the comics artist Will Eisner uses in his very important book, Comics and Sequential Art. Now, Eisner describes comics, he prefers the term sequential art. So it's art, sure, fine, we all know what art is, more or less, and art in sequence, right? So comics tells a narrative. We have a sequence of art, but he says, if you had a comic that tried to emulate film, so a comic that tried to sort of, if you took, as you can see here, you took a comic that had an image of every major sort of scene or film perspective, camera perspective in film, and then put it out on a comics page, it wouldn't really make any sense. And this is what he calls the reading rhythm of film. And it's almost like a kind of connected close-ups, and it jumps around much more than comics do, because because it has a much more steady flow. The narrative is much more like a prose narrative or a written narrative. It's continuous. We don't see the gaps. So if you translate into the comics page, you know, a bit like here, you might get a gist of what's going on, but there's just this guy, there's just this gun, there's just a blast, there's someone's dead. You could just about piece together that this guy maybe has pulled his gun and shot that guy, if you follow that routine there. But in a comic print narrative, we want to make things a little bit more clear. So actually, in comics, you might choose to show different things to have what Eisner calls a different reading rhythm. So again, we're seeing how time functions spatially, not just as the grid, but even what you choose to show, right, is changed because of the demands that are placed on the reader in order to piece together the content. And so the content needs to be thought about differently. And I think this is really interesting if we're thinking about that idea of kind of popular and low culture that we were talking about earlier. And, you know, are comics worthy of study on an undergraduate literature course? Or, you know, should they be found there, or should we leave those to, you know, kind of popular culture? This is a really interesting word. If you look down here that Eisner uses, he uses that it requires reading comics not like film, which is, you know, a flow of connected close-ups that is very kind of quite passive. You know, we just sit and watch a film. We don't have to, I mean, obviously some film plots are complicated and we have to, you know, try and piece them together to work out what's happening. But even in the comic, even in the basic page of a comic, even in that basic Black Panther page, we still have to be quite intellectual about it, right? We still have to piece different parts of the narrative together. And as you can see, that some of the kind of different techniques that happen are explored by another critic, Nick Sasanis, in his book on flattening. And you can see that Sasanis is talking here about maybe a way to think of comics is not as a narrative sequence at all, but as a system, right? So we have, we can read them sequentially, but actually they're all kind of all interrelated at any one point. And actually we could read this panel here against this panel here. We could read, you know, this ferret, for example, might be looking up at this bird, or these branches are connected right down through to these branches. And whilst the Buddha kind of draws our attention in the center, it's all kind of connected. It's almost like a kind of Buddhist philosophy of being, which everything is connected. Now, I'm just going to skip a panel and a video because I want just to conclude by showing you what this can do when we start applying these interesting concepts of time and space in comics to narratives that aren't about superheroes, but are about kind of really important historical events, and how they allow us to think about those historical events in interesting ways. So again, written through the 1980s, published from the late 70s through to and all through the 1980s as a comic in serial form, is Art Spiegelman's The Complete Mouse. And I hope some of you will have heard of this, but if not, I strongly recommend it. And it's a story in which Art Spiegelman interviews his father, Wladek Spiegelman. And his father, Wladek Spiegelman, survived Auschwitz. They're Jews from Poland, and they escaped to America at the end of the Second World War. And Art, who was not born at the time, asked his father about his experience of Auschwitz as the kind of, you know, one of the worst things that humanity has ever done. And he reimagines his father's memories of Auschwitz and of the Holocaust in comics form. And so we have a real jarring juxtaposition here, right, of this apparently low, unserious, popular cultural format being used to describe the most kind of serious, if you like, most terrifying, most unrepresentable event in history. And as if to make that even more provocative, Spiegelman draws all the Jewish people in his comics as mice and all the Nazis as cats, to visualize this kind of the chasing, if you like, or the sort of terrifying horror of the Holocaust through these very simple, sort of very kind of typically through a visual iconography that is very typical of comics. If you think of everything from kind of Snoopy through to something like Garfield, you know, animals are everywhere in comics. But I just want to show you some of the ways in which representing time as space allows Spiegelman to reflect on the way in which we remember the Holocaust. Now remember, the 1980s is a time when the people who did survive Auschwitz, who did survive the Holocaust, are beginning to die. They're old. And so it becomes really important actually at this time to document and to try and return to the Holocaust as an event, and to try and capture the stories of the people that survived it. And they're not that many, right? Because so many people died in the camps. So comics represents itself as a really interesting way to do this, because it can show how, for Holocaust survivors, because time is space, it can show how these things that happened in the past for Wladek, who went through them, carry on actually experiencing carry on happening almost as a kind of traumatic memory. They repeat in the present. So rather than time being something that is over and past, the Holocaust is something that we should forget about. Because comics represent time spatially, if you think about Dr. Manhattan seeing through time and being able to realize how time and space come together on the page, when we transfer this to something like the Holocaust, it allows us to see how our modern world, how first of all, how Vladek's world, but also our modern world is completely shaped by Auschwitz, and how we need, in order to deal with these kind of serious topics, we need a form that's able to reach back in time and to question, you know, what it is to mean to look at an image from the past, and to think about how that image continues to be meaningful in the present. As you can see here, these are the comics panels themselves begin to melt away into photographs of that past, that pre-Holocaust past. And we can see how those images are now inseparable from the people who died in the Holocaust, and how we need to constantly remember that past and to account for the impact of the Holocaust on our present. And, you know, the least of all suspected mediums, people would be, you know, trying all kinds of serious artistic forms to deal with something as complicated and as moving and as horrific as the Holocaust. But actually, comics, with their unique representation of time spatially on the page, are a really efficient medium of way of dealing with those complex ideas or histories. That is to say, the complexity of the content and the trauma of the content can be communicated through the form of the comic, which, as we can see here, can be incredibly innovative, just as we saw in those the Frank Miller comics and the Moore comics at the beginning of this talk. So I've talked for over 40 minutes now. I'm going to stop and give you a chance to ask me some questions on the chat. Please ask me about anything I've talked about, but if you have more general questions about comics or graphic novels, or about the English course at City and how we teach graphic novels there, then please do ask those questions as well. So thanks so much, and I'll look forward to receiving your questions.